Well, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to pick up where we left off last time, finish with our discussion of the contact between the Europeans and the natives, and then proceed to main subject of today, which will be to talk about the colonial period and the revolutionary period. So last we left off with describing this meeting, the first Europeans since the Vikings, that is, to arrive in the Americas, 1492, and this initial exchange between Columbus and the Spanish explorers and the Taino natives. And as I said last time, Columbus did record exchanges and interactions between the two groups, although we have to question to what degree they interacted, since, as I said, they would not have spoken a word of each other's language, and they would have come from different cultures and different backgrounds. But what becomes evident when we look at not just the record that Columbus himself keeps, but also subsequent events, was that Columbus and the Spanish were eager to immediately impose a familiar framework onto this place. And as I said last time, not a kind of inexplicable thing to do. When confronted with something different and alien, the tendency is to try to organize it according to your own framework or what you're accustomed to. Hence Columbus's conclusion, which even at the time was clearly wrong, that he had found India because he knows of India. He does not know of the Americas. So he decides, well, this must be a place that is familiar to me. Not that he'd been to India, but he knew of the place. And so too with bringing the natives immediately into a Judeo-Christian framework and deciding that they're heathens and that they need to be converted immediately to Christianity. The Judeo-Christian framework had nothing to do with the Taino natives. I mean, they had never heard of Christ or the Bible because they're coming from a completely different culture, but Columbus and the Spanish are eager to bring them into that framework as quickly as possible because that's the way to make sense of what they're seeing and the people that they're encountering. And finally, the nascent growings of a capitalist system, which was still really in its infancy at this point. I mean, to a degree, they were coming from a feudal material paradigm. You took the class last semester, you'll remember about feudalism and the kind of rigid hierarchical structure of society. The ideas of capitalism and, more importantly, the practices of capitalism were still just percolating at this time from the 1300s. But nonetheless, you see the imposition of that framework onto this land, which is basically based on gobbling up the resources as quickly as possible. Thus, Columbus claims the land that he's found in the name of the Spanish monarchy, decides that now this belongs to Spain and even starts renaming the places he's arrived in, even though there are already people living there. 4 voyages in total, establishing a greater presence each time. Columbus actually left some people where he had landed the first time. That was partly due to the logistics of the situation of bringing people back, but also just to establish some sort of garrison there. Not a lot of people, about 40 people, since there were not a lot of people to begin with. Came back in the second voyage and discovered those 40 people had all been killed for reasons unknown, actually. It's not clear why that happened. But it was sort of beside the point the second time because this was a much bigger convoy, as you can see, from 3 ships, small group of people. The second time, 17 ships and 1,200 men, all men, no women, but this time including not just maritime explorers, but also farmers and artisans as well. So other people who are going to contribute to this process of colonization. Now, in order to put together this second voyage, it would have been important for Columbus to convince the ruling authorities back home that it is worth going back there. So hence the reason of describing the natives as being friendly and welcoming, and also whatever story he was spinning about the abundance of resources, the abundance of cheap or free labor, as the case might be. I mean, this is how you get an investment in this project. But even at this point, this second voyage was basically meant to be self-sustaining. In other words, whatever resources they're going to pick up, whatever money they're going to have to make, they kind of had to do it on their own. You notice the voyages here, Columbus's voyages, and you note that he actually explored quite extensive parts of, say, the coastline of Central America and also parts of South America as well. So he wasn't just getting a very kind of limited snapshot of the Caribbean. He actually saw quite a lot of this region, and yet still apparently clung to the idea that he had found India. He never let that idea go, even though it must have become increasingly evident to him that that was not the case. Not really clear why he kept with that idea, probably because he wanted to believe that his version of the voyage had been a success. He had an idea in his mind of what he was going to find when he set out. He had an idea that the Eastern world was such and such a number of kilometers away, that they could reach it in a month, and he just sort of clung to that idea until he died, even though, I mean, every time he went back, it must have become more and more evident that he was wrong in his assessment. As I said, the initial European expansion into the Americas occurred within the logic of a religious paradigm, and that was an all-pervading religious paradigm at the time. Again, this kind of takes us back to the class last semester, but their whole worldview is being filtered through a Judeo-Christian religious framework. They don't separate topics such as politics, science, exploration, marriage, childbirth, whatever you want to talk about. It's all being filtered through a religious framework because that's how they see the world. But also, as I said, within the structures of nascent capitalism, the voyages were soon financing themselves and built atop the acquisition of things that could be converted into wealth, whether they were precious metals, spices, crops, or people. In fact, I would say that if you want to talk about something that provided the impetus, the shove towards a capitalist paradigm, it had to be the landing of the Europeans in the Americas. There were already kind of inklings of a capitalist system starting to develop, but in terms of really leading to a transition, really leading to a transition in labor, in the distribution of wealth, in the entire social order. The arrival of the Europeans in the Americas had to count as the biggest thing. We cannot, as I said, we cannot underestimate the impact of this. I don't think the Earth, at least, you know, as far as we can tell for human history, is ever going to experience anything like this again. Two separate worlds, two separate hemispheres, entire continents of people unaware of each other's existence. It's like landing on another planet or something, entering into this collision between these different cultures and these different people. These of capitalism, well, the acquisition of stuff that can be converted into wealth. And it is true at that time, and it is true today, that there are a whole bunch of what we might call cash crops or cash cows. In other words, the things that always sell. I mean, that's the kind of logic of capitalism. It doesn't really matter whether something is useful per se. No, you just have to be able to sell it. You just have to make people want to buy it. And so when it comes to crops, when it comes to agriculture, we plant a whole bunch of the same stuff over and over again. Why? Because it sells. And it doesn't matter what it is. It's corn, it's soy, it's tobacco, it's coffee, it's cannabis, whatever. If people buy it, then you plant a whole bunch of it. And the same logic at this time. There are certain things that people want, precious metals like gold and silver, which are kind of becoming like currency at the time, but also just certain crops like sugarcane, for instance, cotton, later on, tobacco too as well. Tobacco is kind of, when you get down to it, a kind of useless thing, right? But nonetheless, people want it, right? So thus it becomes a valuable commodity, and people as well. People who can be bought and sold as commodities because people are being treated as commodities at this time. In other words, for purchase and exchange. The thing with the invasion of the Americas is it led to this kind of transition where when you look at Europe, you have a very limited amount of land. I mean, Europe has a bunch of small kingdoms clustered close together, and the land is all owned by a tiny group of people. I mean, it's the upper echelons of society, the aristocrats, the royal family, and the overwhelming majority of people in Europe in the late 1400s and the 1500s, I mean, they own nothing. I mean, they're just peasants who work on the land. The shift towards the Americas is, from the Europeans' perspective, suddenly you have a whole bunch of land. I mean, that's the kind of transition where they're seeing these vast continents full of resources that can be mined and exploited. So the ownership of land is not really the issue anymore. It's how you can take that land and convert it into wealth. And for that, you need to grow things or find things that are valuable that you can sell. And you also need a whole vast array of people to work on that land and to work as cheaply as possible, in many cases as freely as possible, hence the institution of servitude and slavery, which became instrumental to the growth of the Americas. As for Columbus, what happened to him? Well, he governed Hispaniola, the island Dominican Republic in Haiti today, for several years and seemed to turn it into his own kind of fiefdom before he was deposed following accounts of his brutal treatment of both the natives and Spanish settlers. There's no question that he kind of fit within the logic at the time of practicing atrocities against the native population, supporting the institution of slavery. The reports at the time, the reports that came out of Hispaniola, made the argument that Columbus was unusually brutal in his treatment of people, that he basically became this power-hungry despot with no regard whatsoever for the people around him. I say those accounts remain somewhat disputed, and the reason that they're disputed is because the people making those reports were eager to depose Columbus. So in other words, they wanted to paint him as this individual because they wanted to kick him out of Hispaniola as the governor. Now that could have been because he really was this horrible tyrant, this brutal figure, but it also could have been for other reasons. I mean, the Spanish settlers and colonists in Hispaniola probably disliked Columbus, if only because he was Italian. I mean, that would have been enough from the start for them to dislike him because he's a foreigner from their perspective. So they might have had their own reasons for wanting to paint this picture of Columbus. He actually returned back to Spain in chains, but did resume his maritime exploration subsequently, as they say, traveling along portions of Central and South America, though he apparently retained his belief that he had found part of India. It's kind of one of those incredible things. And you see Columbus as a legacy, different versions of it, that there are so many statues and so many places named after this person still to this day, and the work of people defacing statues or just taking them down. I mean, that's been a kind of ongoing process. It's that kind of mixture of things with Columbus, the individual, the person who instigated this expansion, this territorial conquest, but also someone, when you look at him, he's a conduit for a system. He's a conduit for an entire worldview, an entire paradigm, probably not unusual in terms of his perspective, his views, and of course in terms of the things we did as piecing together something from the distant past. So the colonies and the Revolutionary period we're going to look at today. The tragedy of the Americas, which I mentioned but bears repeating. The growth of the 13 colonies, which was basically British America, what would eventually become the United States, and the American Revolution, which occurs in the late 18th century. Tragedy of the Americas, referring to the Native Americans, the tragedy of the European invasion, the invading microbes, and the Spanish Empire versus English hopes for an empire, because we're talking about the Americas, but the focus is again on the United States, since that's what the main focus of the class is. And I should reiterate something I said, that this is kind of making one narrative of history, but I don't want you to think it's the kind of definitive narrative. These are just the points that I'm extrapolating to focus on as we move through it, but we're talking, of course, about hundreds of years. There's a lot of different things we can touch upon in all of it. So just one narrative, one thread across history. But I think one thing that does stand out is if you were to look at the European invasion of the Americas, there was a tragedy that was involved in that, and that was the catastrophic collapse of the Native American population, and the ongoing legacy of that, of course, is still very much present, still very much with us today. This would have to be considered a human tragedy of the last 500 years, if you wanted to identify something like this, because, as I say there, estimates indicate that between 50 and 100 million Native American people lived in the pre-Columbian Americas. So this was just a massive portion of the total human population, the total global population on the planet, people who lived in the Americas. And over the following centuries, the population would drop to as low as 10% of that total. It's difficult to estimate because we don't know exactly how many people were there originally. And there was also a kind of integration of the Native American people, especially in South and Central America, less so in North America. Case in point, there may have been approximately 5 million natives in North America in 1492. Again, just an estimate. Might have been more, might have been less. By 1800, that population would have been about 600,000. So a precipitous drop in the total number of people. But you also have to put that in the context of what was happening at this time, which is a large population increase in other parts of the world. So the total human population was actually increasing, and it would really take off after the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, especially in Europe. That's where you suddenly see this kind of exponential growth in the number of people. So it wasn't just that the total numbers of Native Americans shrank, but proportionally speaking, their kind of share in the total world population shrank very considerably over this period. We touched upon this question of why. Why and how would this happen? Why did the contact with these foreign people from overseas basically decimate 2 continents worth of people? And that, of course, is the question that is still discussed and debated today. You see a film, Aguirre, The Wrath of God, one of Herzog's films from 1972, brilliant film about the Spanish invasion of the Americas from the 1500s, shot on location, so very interesting film. As I mentioned before, the Europeans did have certain technological and military advantages. So if you wanted to speak about just conquest and encroaching on native territory, taking over portions of land, well, there were certain things that they did have in terms of steel weaponry, armor, gunpowder, for instance. Like those things gave them these kinds of militaristic advantages. But a very important point to consider here, it would have been impossible for them to conquer 2 entire continents and to single-handedly destroy a population of up to 100 million people. Absolutely impossible. They never could have done that because we're talking about, again, the 1500s, people arriving overseas in these makeshift boats, entering into this unknown land. They do not have the ability, logistically and practically speaking, to overrun the entire continent. And I think too often when we talk about the European invasion of the Americas, there's a tendency to adopt a kind of glib ahistorical perspective and to speak about the massacre and destruction of the Native Americans as though it was this kind of unified process that happened all in one shot. And the tendency, and we'll talk about this when we discuss the colonies a little bit too, the tendency is to kind of pretend as though these different centuries were all the same, as though the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1800s, and the 1900s are all kind of part of the same thing, the same process, as if it makes no real difference. Well, it certainly does make a difference, right? I mean, consider the difference. Here we are in the year 2023. Imagine I told you that it makes no difference if we're in the year 1923 or 1823. Yeah, it does, right? It makes a difference of several hundred years. So what actually happened? Well, this was predominantly the march of the microbes, the invasion of infectious diseases, which, I mean, this is something that we think about in relation to COVID. Recent events speaks to a kind of entire thread in human history. There you see an Aztec image. I mentioned the Aztec Empire previously, of people suffering from smallpox. The Europeans introduced numerous diseases, some of which had a minor effect on them, but a devastating one on natives. Examples included smallpox, measles, chickenpox, as well as various others. Some diseases which were not benign, but they weren't particularly threatening to people who had already had them, but in the case of the Native American, could be devastating to them, could be fatal diseases. So there was very much this kind of one balanced transmission of diseases one way, not exclusively, but mostly one way from the Europeans to the local population. There was nothing in the way of what we might describe as biological warfare, at least not in the 1500s and 1600s. Later, European invaders might have celebrated the outbreak of epidemics, might have even tried to promote the outbreak of epidemics for the purposes of clearing out native populations. But at this time, not at all, because they didn't even understand how diseases spread at this time. I mean, the Europeans assumed that this was some kind of divine visitation, retribution on the natives for not being Christian. The natives thought that the Europeans were practicing some kind of sorcery or witchcraft. In terms of modern science, modern medicine, I mean, they didn't have an understanding of even how diseases are spread, so they didn't really understand how this was happening. I say there are certain outbreaks, half of a native population in a given region would die within 10 years, and repeated epidemics would prevent their population numbers from rebounding, so sinking population numbers steadily over time. And in terms of why this would happen, well, I mentioned some of the speculative reasons before, but it's one of those things where we can't really grasp exactly the underlying logic of it. It just seems as though this one group of people had been exposed and had developed immunity to some quite virulent diseases, and other people had not. And this was the biggest aid, the biggest support in the European invasion of the Americas. Nothing helped them more than the spread of diseases. Nothing in terms of their technology or industry or anything besides that. It was diseases that basically made all the difference in destroying the native population. Initially, the empire in the Americas was the Spanish Empire, Portuguese Empire as well, but the biggest one, the most prominent imperial state at this time was from Spain. There you can see during the 1500s, the Spanish, again aided by the spread of diseases, were able to claim huge portions of the Americas in the name of the Spanish crown, and they constructed this empire draped, you can see, significant portions, not just of South and Central America, but all across North America too. The vast majority of what would eventually become the United States, up into Canada as well. Hence the prevalence of the Spanish language in the Americas today. You can see the idea of an empire built across a sea route, a waterway. That has traditionally been the case, not always, but often the case with imperial states. Time was the Roman Empire. The imperial state in Europe from the past, from classical times, was built around the Mediterranean Sea, so draped across the Mediterranean in Europe and parts of North Africa. Well, here you have an empire that is built around the Atlantic Ocean, essentially, and even touching the Pacific Ocean as well. This idea of the Spanish Empire controlling these massive waterways, these sea routes, and it's the shipping back and forth that's basically accounting for the growth of this giant empire at the time. By contrast, since we're going to talk about United States, by contrast, England lacked the wealth and resources to build an empire of this extent. And again, we have to kind of look at things in the properly historical context. The assumption sometimes would be the idea that since America started, and here I'm talking about the United States, since America started as an English colony, and since America would eventually emerge as this superpower state, it must have been that the English colonials brought some sort of really advanced culture or civilization to the Americas from the start. Well, not so. I mean, in the late 1500s, the main reason that England did not have a colony was because England was a kind of smallish peripheral country in Europe. I mean, quite a poor place, actually, compared to some of the other larger powers in Europe. And the idea that England was going to start building a very large empire, indeed, a massive empire in the 19th century, I mean, that was not on anyone's radar in the late 16th century. In fact, England didn't even control all of the British Isles. Scotland is still an independent nation at this juncture. Nonetheless, a colony does grow in the Americas, and this is what we're going to talk about, the growth of the 13 colonies, as they were known, which would eventually become the United States. Say they're a beginning point for the discussion motives, incentives for developing an overseas colony. The first case study, we're going to look at Virginia. Case study number 2, New England, and the 1700s, closer ties and increasing independence. Here you see a map demonstrating the progressive growth of the English colonies from the early 1600s to the time of the Revolution in 1776. And the first thing to notice is that this is quite a small place, at least compared to what we saw with the Spanish Empire, also the French Empire, which I didn't show you, but wound up occupying a large part of North America. This initially, and you can see the differences here before 1660, just little snippets of land, basically, where there are these English settlements on the eastern seaboard of what would eventually become the United States, growing thereafter. But even when we get close to the Revolutionary period towards the end of the 18th century, it's still not a whole lot of land. It's just this kind of narrow strip covering the area from New England down into the southern states, and these kind of sporadic developments built around various port locations, such as Boston and New York City. To mention the motives for developing this colony, there you see a painting depicting the first lasting English settlement in the Americas, which was famously at Jamestown in what would eventually become Virginia. And that was in the year 1607. So keep in mind, European expansion and conquest has been going on for over 100 years by this point. And there hasn't really been an English presence in the Americas prior to this. This idea of England wanted a colony so that it could gain access to gold, silver, dyes, and sugar, among other things, instead of having to rely on Spain and Portugal for these items. So if you wanted a kind of traditional commercial explanation for why they were eager to develop a colony, well, it's basically because they hear stories about the presence of various precious metals in the America. And it's one of the things with precious metals like gold and silver, traditionally people all over the world and throughout history have deemed them valuable. It's one of the kind of interesting stories about human history. Gold is one of those things where it doesn't matter what period, what time, or what place, people everywhere like gold. Has that kind of connotation. So the Native Americans valued gold in the same way that the Europeans did, and so they were invested in finding it as well. But other things as well, tropical products, as they might be called, dyes and sugar, among other things, later cotton, famously, tobacco as well. There are various things that you cannot grow in England. The climate is just not conducive to growing these very valuable commodities. So if you want access to them, well, you can trade with people, which is what they were doing. But they were trading with Spain and Portugal, who had these giant empires and could basically dictate the terms of trade. But the alternative, during the nascent days of imperialism, was to go acquire land where you could grow this stuff. And that's what they were interested in doing, acquiring land where you can grow these products which only thrive in tropical locations. So simple kind of a commercial incentive, commercial motivation was part of it. And again, it takes us back to that idea of the growth of capitalism, those goods, those products that everybody wants. That stuff that you can sell to anybody for the greater profit of the British crown. I mean, it's a kind of small group of people who stand to profit from this process. But a desire to deal with the social ills in England was another factor, because there were very social ills that had grown in the late 1500s. That would be towards the end of Elizabeth I's reign as queen. That was a figure I mentioned last semester. You remember, Elizabeth I was a queen, a monarch who reigned for a very long time, brought some kind of religious stability to England, and this was also a period where the English Renaissance really took off with Shakespeare, various threads of English literature. But the latter part of her reign was defined really by social malaise and increasing poverty. It was a period of kind of long decline towards the end of her reign. Vagrancy, theft, public drunkenness, prostitution, just criminal activity, all of those things were becoming more prominent in the late 1500s in England. And so founding a colony became a kind of way of dealing with those problems, dealing with the threats of a kind of descent into social disorder, because it became a way to sort of ship out people that you don't necessarily want in England. I mean, that was basically how they were planning on populating the colony originally. Well, you need people to work here. You need people to grow these crops or to settle the colony. Well, we have an abundance of cheap labor, ready-made and available here. We have a bunch of layabouts and criminals who can't find work or don't want to find work. Okay, get them to go overseas. So here were the kind of, the original pioneers, right, of America, the people who are kind of celebrated in countless different patriotic narratives, basically at the start to a degree, people that England didn't want. You see an image of tobacco fields in the early 1700s. Now, insofar as this became a way to sort of solve social problems in England, it immediately fed into the idea of servitude and slavery becoming a norm in Virginia and the other colonies. As I said before, products that can be bought and sold, but also people who can be bought and sold as well. People treated as commodities in the growing stages of capitalism, and this became the norm in the colonies. In the 1600s, about 75% of the people arriving in the new colonies came as servants from the British Isles, predominantly from England. And as I said, most of them were undesirables who've been deceived into making the journey or were outright abducted. So they were just kidnapped and put on these ships and sent overseas. And they were subject to arbitrary punishment, abuse, and even murder in the new land. They became people known as indentured servants. Essentially, they would be asked to pay off the debt of making the journey to the Americas, and they would be told that it would take something like 5 years. And in the meantime, they had to work to pay off this debt that they'd accrued by traveling across the Atlantic. And as long as they were in debt, they were basically treated as a servant or even as a piece of property, as the case might have been. And they'd be working and working, looking to pay off the debt. And then, likely as not, they would die before the 5 years were up because the conditions in the colonies were brutal and toxic to the people living there. The first slaves from Africa arrived in Virginia as early as 1619. So this would have been shortly after colony had initially been founded. So it wasn't just people, quote, undesirables from the British Isles who were being shipped overseas, but also people who had been abducted as well from the west coast of Africa. As I say there, however, until the late 1600s, local plantation owners preferred indentured servants, mainly because they were going to die quickly anyway. And again, we have to kind of make that historical distinction. We have to, again, keep from sort of collapsing centuries together and pretending that the 1600s were exactly the same as the 1700s. A little bit of a different story and a narrative in the 1600s. There wasn't really a huge slave trade operating in North America at this time. Certainly there was in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, where they had sugar plantations. That was where there was this large slave trade. But as for the central and southern colonies at the time, there were plantation owners, but they preferred the servants because they're only going to keep the person for 5 years anyway. They expect the person to die before their servitude is up. So why is that better? Well, because if you purchase a slave, you're making a purchase for a lifetime. At least that's the idea. It's too much of an investment as far as they're concerned. So it wasn't anything to do with benevolence or respecting people's rights at all. It was the simple idea that slaves are too expensive to them because you just expect whoever you buy, you're not going to be able to keep the person for your entire life. Rather, they're just going to die in a couple years anyway. Then you have to replace them. So a servant, someone who is, quote, paying off a debt, is a better investment at this time. That changed as conditions in the colonies changed, as the health conditions, such as they were, improved somewhat, as there were more settlements developing at the time, and the transatlantic slave trade emerged as a massive industry, bringing 1.5 million slaves to British America. Again, people treated as pieces of property, effectively abducted, sent across the Atlantic Ocean. Countless people, they don't even know how many people died just in the passage. crammed together in appalling conditions, treated, again, as property, not as people, not as individuals with their own rights, and subject to arbitrary punishment, subject to murder, treated again as just property to be traded and exchanged in the Americas. During the 18th century that the slave trade emerges in earnest. As far as British America was concerned, it had existed in other places previously. And people say, did slavery exist prior to this period? Absolutely. I mean, slavery had existed all across the world. The pre-industrial world, slavery was a ubiquitous practice everywhere you go. But what was really different about this was the scale of transporting people over massive distances. I mean, sending people across an entire ocean in these kinds of numbers. Because slavery is legal, it's part of the commercial enterprise, and so it is conducted within the logic of what has already existed at the time. The slave trade, which we're going to talk about more when we discuss the Civil War era as well, changed the culture of British America in many ways. Among other things, it started to introduce a racial caste system, which, as I said, didn't really exist in the 1600s as such. It's unclear whether the African slaves and the European indentured servants in the 1600s felt solidarity with one another. They would have come from very different cultural backgrounds, but to a degree, they would have kind of been in the same boat. Things started to change in the 1700s with this kind of division between people of European descent and people of African descent in British America. This started to face class distinctions, especially among the white colonists. The class distinctions, which were very rigid at this time, well, this kind of racial division actually helped to create some fluidity in the class differences among the European colonists. The irony of that, though, is that the distribution of wealth was becoming increasingly narrow in the colonies. Initially, you had people taking over land, gobbling up whatever land, establishing their own plantations, trying to work the land for their own benefit. But as often happens in these instances, the wealth becomes more and more concentrated in the hands of a minuscule number of people. When you start talking about the plantation culture that would grow up in the southern United States, which would basically define that region for hundreds of years, you're talking about the affluent, the powerful, the prosperous. It's a tiny portion of the total population. The landowners, again, 5% of the people, essentially, they have everything. Nonetheless, all of the people of European descent, all the white colonists who were poor, who had nothing, nonetheless were afforded some kind of carrot or at least some sort of compensation. They were at least in the position of feeling as though they had more than the slaves. So it became a way to galvanize this idea of white supremacy, which is embedded in the American psyche. Also, racial identity emerged as a firm dividing line in the much celebrated ideal of freedom. From the start, British America had been interested in promoting an ideal of individual freedom, sort of in contrast to the Spanish Empire. Now, it might have been somewhat false, but their perspective was the Spanish Empire was really beholden to the mother country, to Spain, to the monarchy of Spain, and also to the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. Spain remained a Catholic country, but once you start getting into the Reformation, you have England breaking free of Catholicism, and there's this idea that in the colonies, people can be freer from these institutions. In the British colonies, I should say. They are freer from the oversight of the mother country. They're freer from this kind of monopolistic religious institution. They have more opportunities just to develop their own prosperity, their own livelihood. Well, yeah, maybe, but racial identity became the kind of hard line division in terms of what freedom means. It increasingly became this idea that is attached to a particular group of people, namely the colonists of European descent. Those are the people who have the opportunity to be free, and so they understand their freedom just in contrast to slaves who have no freedom at all. And again, I mean, you can see how these things become kind of embedded and ingrained in the American psyche, become part of the cultural ethos of that country. The ideal of freedom, but not freedom for everybody who lives there, but for select groups of people who are divided and almost all the time just according to some arbitrary caste system based on what you are at the moment of your birth. However, probably the biggest thing that started to happen here is a distinct African American cultural identity began to coalesce in what would become America. Because you have to keep in mind that the slaves who were abducted and brought over the transatlantic slave trade came from all different parts of Africa. I mean, this is not kind of one culture. Similar to the Americas, you have all sorts of different groups, different nations, different empires, different language groups as well, and the people treated like property are just lumped together and brought to this new land, and they're just completely displaced, and in many cases severed from the cultures and traditions that they had known. But nonetheless, a new identity thus begins to develop in this new land, a kind of solidarity among these people, and they brought with them a lot of the cultural traditions, a lot of the ideas that belong to their own nations, their own empires back in Africa. So the development of an African American cultural identity, which again, of course, so much a part of American culture today, is traceable really almost to the origins of America before America was even an independent state, going to the 1700s. Okay, yes, so let's take the break here, come back and talk about the second case study of New England.